The rope burned against Natalie Vance's wrists as the wind howled through the Colorado mountain valley, and she wondered if this frozen February night in 1879 would be her last. Her uncle had dragged her from the cabin an hour ago, his breath reeking of whiskey and his eyes wild with the kind of rage that came from losing everything at cards. The snowstorm had rolled in fast over the Rocky Mountains, turning the world into a wall of white that cut visibility down to nothing. Natalie's thin cotton dress provided no protection against the bitter cold that seeped into her bones, and ice crystals were already forming in her long, dark hair. She had stopped screaming 20 minutes ago when her throat grew too raw, and she realized no one would hear her anyway. The gambling debt her uncle owed was substantial, nearly $500 to a man in Denver who did not take kindly to being cheated. When Natalie had discovered the marked cards hidden in his room and threatened to turn him into the marshal, he had snapped. She was 21 years old and had been living with her uncle since her parents died of typhoid 3 years prior, working as a seamstress in the small mining town to contribute to the household. She had saved nearly $200 with plans to move to San Francisco and open her own dress shop, but her uncle had found the money 2 days ago and gambled it all away. The argument that followed had been vicious, with Natalie telling him she would report him to the authorities for theft. His solution had been simple and cruel. Tie her to the hitching post outside during the worst blizzard to hit the Colorado Rockies in a decade. Natalie's fingers had gone numb first, then her toes, and now a dangerous warmth was starting to spread through her chest. She knew what that meant. She had seen men freeze to death in previous winters, their bodies found stiff and blue when the snow melted. Her mind drifted to thoughts of her mother, the way she used to braid Natalie's hair and sing old Irish songs while they worked on quilts together. The memory was so vivid she could almost hear the melody carried on the wind. Then she heard something else. Hoofbeats. Heavy and steady, cutting through the storm with purpose. Natalie tried to lift her head, but her neck muscles would not cooperate. The horse came closer, and through her fading vision she saw a dark shape dismount. Strong hands touched her face, and a man's voice cut through the howling wind. "Jesus Christ," the voice said, rough and deep. "Who the hell did this to you?" Natalie tried to answer, but her lips would not form words. She felt the man's knife sawing through the frozen rope at her wrists, felt him catch her as her legs gave out completely. He was large and solid, and even through her dying senses she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He wrapped something heavy around her, a thick wool coat that smelled of leather and pine smoke. "Stay with me," he commanded, and there was something in his voice that made her want to obey. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest as he moved toward the cabin. Natalie felt him kick the door open with his boot, heard him swear when he saw the empty room with its dying fire. "Where is he?" the man demanded, but Natalie could only manage a weak shake of her head. Her uncle had left hours ago, probably headed to the saloon in town to drink away his guilt or perhaps to run from his creditors. The stranger carried her to the fireplace and set her down gently on the worn rug. He immediately set about building up the fire, adding log after log until flames roared to life. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said, his voice businesslike despite the intimate nature of the statement. "You will die if I do not. Do you understand?" Natalie managed a slight nod. She trusted this stranger more than she had trusted her own uncle, and besides, she was too far gone to care about propriety. She felt his hands, surprisingly gentle for their size, working at the buttons of her dress. He stripped away the frozen fabric and wrapped her in blankets he found in the bedroom, then rubbed her hands and feet with careful pressure to restore circulation. The pain when feeling started to return was excruciating, like thousands of needles stabbing into her flesh, and Natalie cried out. "I know it hurts," the man said, his blue eyes meeting hers with unexpected compassion. "But it means you are coming back. Just hold on." She studied his face in the firelight. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled at his collar and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard. His nose had been broken at least once, and a scar cut through his left eyebrow, but there was something handsome in the rough planes of his face. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, worn denim pants, a flannel shirt, and leather chaps crusted with snow. "What is your name?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "Mason Fletcher," he replied, still working on her frozen feet. "I am a foreman at the Double Bar Ranch about 5 miles north of here. I was riding back from town when the storm hit and saw your cabin. Thought I would wait it out here, but I sure as hell did not expect to find someone tied up outside like a damned animal." "Natalie," she said. "Natalie Vance." Mason's jaw tightened. "Who did this to you, Natalie? Was it your husband?" "My uncle," she replied, and the shame of it burned hotter than the returning circulation in her limbs. "He gambled away my savings and I threatened to turn him in. He has drinking problems, always has." Mason's hands stilled on her feet, and when he looked up at her, there was a fury in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Where is he now?" "I do not know. He left me here to die." Mason stood abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. "When the storm clears, I am taking you to the marshal. Your uncle will hang for this." "He is still family," Natalie said weakly, though she was not sure why she was defending the man who had tried to murder her. "Family does not do this," Mason said, his voice hard. "Family protects. Family would die before letting harm come to their own." He turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. "You got any other kin around here?" Natalie shook her head. "Just him. My parents died 3 years back. I have been working as a seamstress, saving money to leave." Mason nodded slowly, processing this information. "Well, you cannot stay here, not with him liable to come back, and not alone in this weather." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "The ranch where I work, the owner is a widow named Mrs. Harriet Cross. She runs a respectable operation with about 20 hands. She has been looking for someone to help with the cooking and mending now that her old housekeeper passed. Room and board plus $30 a month. I could speak to her if you want." Natalie stared at him, surprised by the offer. "You would do that for a stranger?" "You are not a stranger anymore," Mason said simply. "And any decent man would do the same." The storm raged outside for another 6 hours, during which Mason kept the fire burning and made simple food from the meager supplies in the cabin. He found some old clothes that had belonged to Natalie's late aunt and dressed her in layers of wool, then made her drink hot coffee laced with a bit of whiskey from a flask he carried. He told her about the Double Bar Ranch, about the 100 head of cattle they ran and the good horses Mrs. Cross bred. He spoke of the mountains and valleys of Colorado with the kind of love that comes from truly belonging to a place. Natalie found herself watching the way firelight played across his features, the way his hands moved with confidence and capability as he worked. There was a steadiness to Mason Fletcher that drew her like a moth to flame. He did not pry into her life or make her feel ashamed of her circumstances. He simply treated her with a respect and kindness she had not known since her parents died. As dawn broke and the storm finally began to clear, Mason saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper. "Can you ride?" he asked Natalie. "Yes," she said, though in truth she was still shaky on her feet. "We will take it slow," Mason said. He helped her into the saddle first, then swung up behind her, wrapping one strong arm around her waist to steady her. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through Natalie that had nothing to do with the layers of clothing between them. She could feel the solid muscle of his chest against her back, the way his thighs bracketed hers as they rode. The journey to the Double Bar Ranch took nearly 3 hours through snow-choked trails. Mason kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling stories that kept Natalie's mind off the cold and her aching body. He spoke of growing up in Missouri, of coming west after the war to make his own way. His father had been a farmer who lost everything when Union troops burned their fields, and Mason had left at 16 with nothing but a horse and a bedroll. "I worked my way through Kansas, learned cattle from a drover on the Kishome Trail," Mason said. "Ended up in Colorado 5 years ago and never wanted to leave. Something about these mountains just gets into your blood." "I know what you mean," Natalie said softly. "I have thought about leaving, going to California, but part of me cannot imagine being anywhere else." The Double Bar Ranch appeared through the lifting snow like something from a dream. The main house was a large 2-story structure built from local timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including a massive barn, a bunkhouse for the hands, and a stable that looked well maintained. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and Natalie could see several men moving about doing morning chores. Mason rode straight to the main house and dismounted, then helped Natalie down with careful hands. "Wait here a moment," he said, and disappeared inside. Natalie stood on the porch, her heart pounding with nervousness. What if Mrs. Cross did not want her? What if Mason had overestimated his ability to help? The door opened, and a woman emerged who immediately put Natalie at ease. Harriet Cross was perhaps 50 years old, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes the color of summer grass. She wore a simple calico dress with an apron, and her hands were work-roughened and capable. "Lord have mercy, child," Mrs. Cross said, looking Natalie up and down with concern. "Mason told me what happened. Come inside this instant. You look half frozen still." The interior of the house was warm and welcoming, with well-made furniture and colorful quilts draped over chairs. Mrs. Cross led Natalie to the kitchen and sat her down at a large wooden table, then poured hot coffee and set out fresh bread with butter and jam. "Eat," Mrs. Cross commanded. "Mason says you have experience with sewing." "Yes, madam," Natalie said between bites of the best bread she had tasted in months. "I worked as a seamstress in town for the past 3 years. I can also cook and keep house. My mother taught me before she passed." Mrs. Cross nodded approvingly. "My housekeeper died 2 months back, and I have been managing on my own, but it is too much with running the ranch operations. I need someone who can handle the cooking for myself and the hands, do mending and washing, keep the house in order. It is hard work, long days, but I pay fair and I treat my people right. Room and board in the room off the kitchen, $30 a month, and Sundays are your own after breakfast is cleared. Does that suit you?" "Yes, madam," Natalie said, her voice thick with emotion. "More than suits me." "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," Mrs. Cross said with a slight smile. "Wait until you have done a week's worth of cooking for 20 hungry ranch hands. Now let me show you your room so you can rest. You look dead on your feet." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the corral. Natalie sank onto the bed and felt tears slide down her cheeks. 24 hours ago she had been certain she would die, and now she had a safe place to live and honest work. And she had Mason Fletcher to thank for it. She saw him frequently over the following days as she settled into her new life at the Double Bar Ranch. Mason was the foreman, which meant he oversaw all the ranch operations and reported directly to Mrs. Cross. He was up before dawn every day, organizing the hands and setting the day's tasks. Natalie would watch from the kitchen window as he moved among the men with easy authority, his voice carrying across the yard as he gave instructions or offered praise. The cooking was indeed hard work. Natalie rose at 4 each morning to start breakfast for the hands, preparing massive quantities of eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy. She learned to make hearty stews and roasts, to bake bread by the dozen loaves, to stretch ingredients to feed hungry men who worked from dawn to dusk. Her hands grew rough from scrubbing pots and washing clothes, but she did not mind. The work was honest and the environment was safe, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she had a purpose beyond simple survival. Mason made a point of checking on her each day, usually stopping by the kitchen after the evening meal to ask how she was settling in. These conversations started out brief and practical, but gradually grew longer and more personal. He would lean against the doorframe with a cup of coffee, his hat pushed back on his head, and tell her about the day's work or ask about her progress with mending. Natalie found herself looking forward to these moments more than she cared to admit. 3 weeks after her arrival, the marshal from town rode out to the ranch to take Natalie's statement about what her uncle had done. Mason sat with her during the interview, his presence a silent support that gave her courage to tell the truth. The marshal, a grizzled man named Tom Garrett, listened with a deepening frown. "We found your uncle's body 2 days ago," Marshal Garrett said bluntly. "He got caught in that same storm, tried to ride it out in a gulch about 10 miles from your old place. Horse threw him and broke his leg. He froze to death before morning." Natalie felt a complicated rush of emotions, relief that she would not have to testify against him or fear his return, sadness for the wasted life and the man he might have been if drink had not destroyed him, guilt that she felt more relief than sorrow. "I am sorry for your loss," the marshal said, though his tone suggested he thought her uncle had gotten what he deserved. "But I needed you to know. His body is at the undertaker if you want to arrange a burial." After the marshal left, Natalie stood on the porch staring out at the mountains. Mason came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth but not touching. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I do not know what I feel," Natalie admitted. "Is that terrible, that I am glad he is gone?" "It is human," Mason said. "He tried to kill you, Natalie. You do not owe him grief." She turned to look at him and found his blue eyes already on her, intense and searching. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. You saved my life." "Anyone would have done the same," Mason said, but his voice had gone rough. "No," Natalie said firmly. "They would not have. You are a good man, Mason Fletcher." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since the night he found her. Mason reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. "You are a remarkable woman," he said softly, "strong and brave. Beautiful too, though I reckon you do not hear that enough." Natalie's breath caught. No man had ever spoken to her this way with such simple sincerity. "Mason," she whispered. He dropped his hand and stepped back, and she saw the war in his eyes. "I am sorry. That was inappropriate. You work here and I am the foreman. I should not have—" "I am glad you did," Natalie interrupted. "I feel it too, this thing between us." Mason's expression was pained. "You have been through hell. I do not want to take advantage of that. You need time to heal, to figure out what you want." "I know what I want," Natalie said, surprised by her own boldness. But nearly dying had given her a clarity about life. She had wasted 3 years being afraid, being cautious, letting her uncle control her destiny. She was not going to waste any more time. "I want to know you better. I want to see where this leads." Mason looked at her for a long moment, and then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his rough features into something approaching handsome. "Well then," he said, "I guess we will take it slow and see what happens." Their courtship was conducted under the watchful but approving eye of Mrs. Cross, who seemed pleased that her foreman had found someone worthy of his attention. Mason would take Natalie riding on Sunday afternoons, showing her the far reaches of the ranch and the wild beauty of the Colorado mountains. They would pack simple meals and eat by mountain streams, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Natalie learned that Mason was a man of deep feeling beneath his rough exterior. He loved poetry, though he was embarrassed to admit it, and could quote Longfellow and Whitman from memory. He had a gift with horses and a gentle touch with injured animals. He sent half his wages each month to his mother back in Missouri, supporting her after his father's death. He dreamed of one day having his own ranch, a small operation where he could raise quality horses. Mason learned that Natalie was far stronger than her delicate appearance suggested. She had a sharp wit and a talent for mathematics, keeping meticulous accounts for Mrs. Cross and finding ways to save money without sacrificing quality. She read voraciously, borrowing books from the small collection in Mrs. Cross's library. She had her mother's gift for music, and would sometimes sing old ballads while she worked, her voice sweet and clear. As spring came to the mountains and snow gave way to wildflowers, their relationship deepened. Mason kissed her for the first time in late April, standing among a field of columbines with the sun setting behind the peaks. It was a gentle kiss, reverent almost, and when he pulled back his eyes were shining. "I am falling in love with you," he said simply. "I thought you should know." "I already fell," Natalie replied, and kissed him again. By June they were talking about marriage, making plans for a future together. Mason had saved nearly $800 and was negotiating with a rancher in the next valley to purchase 40 acres and a small herd of horses. It would be a modest start, but it was theirs. Mrs. Cross gave them her blessing and her patronage, promising to buy horses from Mason once his operation was established. "You are two of the finest people I know," she told them over dinner one evening. "You deserve every happiness." They were married in July of 1879 in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with the hands all cleaned up and acting as witnesses. Natalie wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored silk Mrs. Cross had gifted her, and Mason wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but devastatingly handsome. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony on the front porch, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed Natalie with a passion that made several of the younger hands hoot and holler. They moved to their new property in August, living in a small cabin while Mason built a larger house with help from some of the double-bar hands who came on their days off. The work was back-breaking but satisfying, and Natalie loved every moment of building a life from nothing. She planted a garden and learned to preserve vegetables for winter. She helped Mason train the horses, discovering she had a gift for working with the animals. She kept their accounts and managed their household with the same efficiency she had brought to Mrs. Cross's kitchen. Their first winter was hard, with heavy snows that tested their preparedness and their resolve. But they had each other, and that made all the difference. On the worst nights, when the wind howled and the cabin creaked, Mason would hold Natalie close and remind her of the night they met. "I thank God for that storm," he would say, "because it brought me to you." "We found each other," Natalie would reply. "That is what matters." By spring of 1880, their ranch was thriving. They had bred several foals that showed promise, and word was spreading about the quality of Fletcher horses. Mason's reputation as a horseman brought buyers from as far as Denver, and Natalie's business sense ensured they made good profits. They hired 2 hands to help with the work, young men who were reliable and respectful. In June, Natalie realized she was pregnant. She told Mason one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he let out a whoop of joy that probably carried to the next ranch over. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a child. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "A baby, Natalie." "We are," she confirmed, her own eyes bright with happy tears. "In February, the doctor thinks." Mason was immediately overprotective, trying to prevent Natalie from doing any heavy work. She tolerated it with amused patience, reminding him that women had been having babies since the dawn of time, and that she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. But she could not deny it was sweet, the way he fussed over her and made sure she rested. Mrs. Cross visited frequently during Natalie's pregnancy, bringing baby clothes she had saved from when her own children were small. The older woman had become like a mother to Natalie, filling the void left by her own mother's death. They would sit together sewing tiny garments and talking about the future, about the hopes and dreams Natalie had for her child. The baby came during a cold snap in late February of 1881, almost exactly 2 years after the night Mason had found Natalie tied in the snow. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 18 hours, and Mason paced the kitchen the entire time wearing a path in the floorboards. Mrs. Cross attended Natalie along with a midwife from town, and their steady presence helped Natalie through the worst of it. When the baby finally arrived, filling the cabin with strong, healthy cries, the midwife wrapped the infant and handed the bundle to Natalie. "You have a son," she said with a smile. Mason came into the bedroom looking terrified and awed in equal measure. When Natalie pulled back the blanket to show him their son's face, red and wrinkled and perfect, she saw tears slide down her husband's weathered cheeks. "He is beautiful," Mason whispered, reaching out one finger to stroke the baby's tiny hand. The infant immediately gripped his father's finger with surprising strength, and Mason let out a choked laugh. "Strong too. That is my boy." They named him Matthew, after Mason's father, with the middle name James after Natalie's father. Matthew Fletcher was a good baby, healthy and alert, with his father's dark hair and what would eventually become his mother's dark eyes. Mason was a devoted father, rising in the night to walk with the baby when he cried, changing diapers without complaint, singing off-key lullabies that made Natalie smile. As Matthew grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. They built a larger house with 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a parlor where Natalie could entertain the few neighbors they had. Mason's horses were now sought after throughout Colorado, and they were able to hire 4 full-time hands plus additional help during busy seasons. The modest 40 acres had grown to nearly 200, with a good mix of pasture and timber. In the spring of 1883, Natalie discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in November she gave birth to a daughter they named Nora, after Natalie's mother. Nora had her father's blue eyes and her mother's delicate features, and from the moment she was born she had both parents wrapped around her tiny fingers. Matthew, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister and would sit beside her cradle for hours making faces to try to get her to smile. Mason would watch his children with an expression of such profound contentment that it made Natalie's heart ache with love. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked him one evening as they sat on their porch watching Matthew chase fireflies in the yard while Nora slept in her cradle nearby. "That night you found me, did you think we would end up here?" Mason considered the question seriously. "I knew you were special," he said. The way you fought to stay alive, the strength in you even when you were half frozen. I knew I wanted to know you better. But this—" he gestured to encompass the house, the land, their children. "This is beyond anything I dared to dream. You gave me a family, Natalie. You gave me a home." "We gave it to each other," Natalie corrected. She reached for his hand and laced their fingers together. "You saved my life that night, Mason. But you did more than that. You gave me a reason to live. You showed me what love is supposed to be." Mason brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Every day I thank God I decided to ride out that storm instead of waiting in town. Every single day." The years passed in a blur of hard work and deep satisfaction. Matthew grew into a sturdy boy who loved horses as much as his father did, while Nora was more interested in books and drawing. In 1886, Natalie gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Marcus and Noel. The house was full of noise and laughter, of skinned knees and childhood illnesses, of school lessons at the kitchen table and family dinners where everyone talked over each other. Mason expanded the ranch operations to include a small cattle herd, and he taught Matthew the business from a young age. Natalie took over managing the books for several neighboring ranches in addition to their own, earning a reputation as someone who could stretch a dollar and spot a bad investment from a mile away. Together, they built something that would last, a legacy for their children and grandchildren. Mrs. Cross passed away peacefully in 1890, leaving the Double Bar Ranch to her son who had returned from back east. In her will, she left a generous sum to Mason and Natalie with a note that said simply, "For the family you have built, may it always flourish." They used the money to purchase an additional 100 acres and to build a proper schoolhouse on their land, where Natalie taught not only her own children, but also the children of their hands and neighboring ranchers. As the 19th century drew to a close, Mason and Natalie would sometimes stand on their porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved. Their hair was touched with gray now, and their hands were marked with the wear of hard years, but their love had only deepened with time. "You ever think about that night?" Natalie asked one evening in February of 1899, exactly 20 years after Mason had found her in the storm. "Every day," Mason said. "It was the night my life truly began." "Mine too," Natalie agreed. She leaned into his solid warmth, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Strange to think that something so terrible led to something so beautiful." "Not strange at all," Mason said. "That is just life. Darkness and light, sorrow and joy, all mixed together. The trick is holding tight to the people you love and weathering whatever storms come." "We have weathered quite a few," Natalie said with a smile. There had been hard years mixed in with the good ones. Droughts that killed their grass and forced them to sell livestock. A bout of influenza that nearly took Matthew when he was 8. The year a mountain lion killed several foals and Mason had spent weeks hunting it down. Financial panics that affected beef and horse prices. But through it all, they had each other. "And we will weather many more," Mason said confidently. Together. Their eldest son Matthew married in 1900, bringing home a sweet-natured woman named Sarah who fit into the family as though she had always been there. They built a house on the western section of the property, and Matthew took over more of the day-to-day ranch operations, allowing Mason to slow down a bit. Natalie and Sarah worked together in the kitchen and the garden, and Natalie felt blessed to have a daughter-in-law who felt more like a daughter. The first grandchild arrived in 1901, a boy Matthew and Sarah named Mason after his grandfather. Holding the infant in his arms, Mason Fletcher had tears in his eyes. "I am a grandfather," he said wonderingly to Natalie. "How did we get so old?" "We got here together," Natalie said. One day at a time, 1 year at a time, and I would not change a single moment. Nora went east to college, something that terrified and thrilled Natalie in equal measure. Her daughter wanted to be a teacher, to help educate young women, and though Natalie missed her desperately during the school year, she was proud beyond measure. Nora came home in summers and regaled them with stories of Boston, of the lectures she attended and the books she was reading. She brought fresh ideas and energy back to the ranch school, modernizing their curriculum. Marcus grew into a quiet, thoughtful young man who was more interested in working with wood than with horses. He became a fine carpenter, building beautiful furniture that was sought after throughout the county. Noel was the wild one, the daughter who could ride as well as any of the hands and who had no interest in traditional women's work. She helped her father and brother train horses and proved to have an intuitive gift for understanding the animals. As the new century progressed, Mason and Natalie gradually transitioned into their roles as the elder generation, advising rather than directing, supporting rather than managing. They took long rides together through their property, revisiting all the places that held memories. The field where Mason had first kissed Natalie, now crisscrossed with fence lines. The spot where they had built their first cabin, now occupied by Marcus's workshop. The meadow where the children had learned to ride, now used as a training ground for young horses. In 1910, on their 31st wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Natalie with a trip to Denver. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate at restaurants, saw a play at the theater. It was the first time they had been away from the ranch together in years, and they enjoyed the luxury even as they both admitted. They missed the mountain air and the sound of horses. On their last evening in the city, as they walked through the gas-lighted streets, Mason stopped and turned to face Natalie. He took both her hands in his and looked at her with the same intensity he had shown that first night. "I want you to know," he said seriously, "that you are the best thing that ever happened to me. These 31 years have been the greatest gift. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is my promise to you." Natalie felt tears prick her eyes. "And you are my everything," she said. "My savior, my partner, my love. You gave me a life I never dared to dream of. Thank you, Mason Fletcher. Thank you for finding me that night. Thank you for cutting me loose and carrying me in. Thank you for loving me." "Always," Mason said, and kissed her right there on the street, not caring who might see. They returned to the ranch refreshed and ready for whatever came next. More grandchildren arrived over the following years, filling the house with noise and chaos during holidays. Matthew and Sarah had 4 children eventually. Nora married a teacher she met in Boston, and they settled in Colorado Springs, visiting frequently. Marcus married a neighbor girl and built them a house on the property. Noel remained unmarried, claiming she was too wild for any man to handle, though she seemed perfectly content running the horse training operations. In 1918, as the world was torn by war and illness, the Fletcher family remained largely safe on their Colorado mountain ranch. Matthew had been too old for the draft, and Marcus had been exempted due to a childhood injury to his leg. They weathered the Spanish flu by isolating on the ranch, and though several of the hands fell ill, they all survived through careful nursing and perhaps a bit of luck. Mason was 67 that year, and Natalie was 60. Both still active and engaged with the ranch, though the hardest work fell to younger shoulders now. They had achieved something remarkable. A thriving multi-generational operation, a family bound by love and respect, and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. One evening in early winter, snow just beginning to fall over the mountains, Natalie and Mason sat together on the porch wrapped in warm blankets. They watched the white flakes drift down, so different from that terrible blizzard of 1879 but inescapably linked to it in their memories. 40 years ago this February, Natalie said softly, you found me in the snow. Best night of my life, Mason said, though I would have preferred better circumstances for our meeting. Natalie laughed. We have told that story so many times to the children and grandchildren. They think it is wildly romantic. It is romantic, Mason protested. Cowboy rescues damsel in distress from a snowstorm. That is straight out of a dime novel. Except the damsel was half dead and not very attractive when you found her, Natalie pointed out. You were beautiful, Mason said firmly. Half frozen, nearly gone, and still fighting to live. That is the most beautiful thing I ever saw. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow. Finally, Natalie spoke again. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had waited out the storm in town that night instead of riding for the ranch? Mason was quiet for a long moment. I try not to think about it, he admitted. Because that world, the one where I did not find you, where we did not have all this, that is not a world I want to imagine existing. Me either, Natalie said. She reached for his hand and squeezed it. Thank you for being stubborn enough to ride through that blizzard. Thank you for being strong enough to survive it, Mason replied. As they sat together watching the snow fall over their ranch, their family safe and warm in houses scattered across the property they had built together, both Mason and Natalie felt the deep contentment that comes from a life well lived. They had faced darkness and found light. They had weathered storms and built something that would last. They had loved deeply and been loved in return. The wind picked up, swirling snow across the yard, and Mason pulled the blanket tighter around both of them. Natalie leaned into his warmth, feeling his solid strength even as age had softened some of his edges. They were no longer the desperate girl and the determined cowboy who had found each other in a blizzard. They were partners who had built a life, a family, and a legacy that would echo through generations. Come inside, Mason said eventually. It is getting cold. In a moment, Natalie said. I just want to sit here a little longer with you. So they stayed, two people who had found each other at the worst possible moment and made it the beginning of something beautiful. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the land they loved in white. But inside them both burned a warmth that no storm could ever extinguish, the warmth of true love that had been tested and proven, that had grown stronger with every passing year. When they finally rose and went inside together, hand in hand as they had been for 40 years, the light from their windows spilled out across the snow-covered yard, a beacon of warmth and love that had been lit on a terrible night in 1879 and had never been extinguished. It would burn on in their children and grandchildren, a legacy of love that had begun when a cowboy cut a woman loose from certain death and carried her into a new life.